Like how much fluid do you have in your muscles? How are they being able to move freely and that kind of stuff. So all that said, I'm kind of saying all that stuff because I never stretch. I just don't. Like when I was younger, taking a lot of drum lessons and starting to play extreme forms of metal, for instance, and I was dealing with things like cramping up and getting tired and endurance and things like that. Things like stretching seemed to me at the time like it was a good idea. And I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I'm just saying now here I am, having played for over 20 years, realizing that when I go gig, I don't ever stretch. I just sit down and do it. And I'm not saying that that's like the way you should do things, but to me, things like locking up and cramping aren't really about stretching. But it could be. For me, it's not about stretching. Usually it's a performance anxiety thing. Or usually it's a lack of fluid in my system, like drinking water, being dehydrated. Or maybe overexertion from working out. But I've actually found since I've been working out regularly, physically I'm able to play drums better, more comfortably. It's not an issue. Like I can sit down and play almost immediately. And I can do gigs without practicing them as long as I have the mental side down. But as it relates to stretching, because at some point you do have to deal with things like muscle growth and being limber, stretching out your muscles and stuff, there are some stretches that I can recommend that I used to do a lot when I was younger. And it's probably because I did so much work on it when I was younger that I don't do it so much now. So here are some basic ones. So you have, to make it really just kind of concise, in your arm, this muscle down here, whatever it's called, it's really important to every stroke that you're playing. This down motion that you do, it's this muscle that you're using. But to lift the stick up, that's using the muscle on top of your arm. So these are two muscle groups here that will get tense and tight. And you want to make sure that you can move them because that's what moves your wrist. So we'll talk about that first. So if you're ever starting to feel tense or you want to loosen up your muscles on the bottom, an exercise that people sometimes will do is keeping your fingers straight and all together, and you grab them and pull them back. And then the straighter you can keep your arm, the more you're going to be able to stretch this muscle underneath. Like if you bring your arm in like this, then you're not doing anything for yourself anymore. Have you ever tried that before?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you feel it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you do this, start lifting your arm up, and not your chest so much, but like if you lift your arm up, you'll start feeling it stretch even more. You got to keep that arm straight. If the arm isn't straight, you won't feel anything. You feel that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's one way you can do it. Okay, so I mentioned the muscle group on the top. So if you wanted to use that same idea, is just pull your wrist down. Now, I don't ever do this because I actually have pretty bad wrists, and I can on command dislocate and relocate my wrists, so I try to avoid these kind of exercises because they're not good for me. But if you don't have that issue, it might work out well for you. So this should stretch out your muscle on the top. Okay. Now let's talk about your hands. Your big muscle that you use when you drum in your hands is going to be this thumb muscle. Mm-hmm. This is the muscle you use when you pinch a stick. And this is actually where the majority of your grip's going to be. And this is the muscle that you use. And you'll notice if you look at your average person's hand, and then compare it to somebody who's been playing drums for a really, really long time, people who play drums for a really long time usually have much beefier muscles right here, because this is that pinching muscle that you use with your thumb. So if that ever cramps up, something you can do is just start pulling your thumb back, and that should stretch out that muscle group. And so you can pull it back this direction towards your body, or being that this is my left hand, out to the left, and that'll just help to limber this muscle group up. And sometimes what I'll also do is, regardless of where I'm having a cramp, just kind of rub it out. Like on my thumb, I could start doing some of this, rubbing it out on my thumb muscle, or down here for that under my forearm muscle group, or up here for the other group. But somewhere else, sometimes you might get cramps, and I don't honestly know exactly what the muscle group looks like and where it is exactly, but somewhere here in your palm. Now, the gripping muscle is actually kind of coming from under your arm more than from your hand. When you actually curl these fingers and hold on to something, it's happening more down here. But there are some smaller muscles in here that can cramp up. And so again, that's kind of one of those things where maybe you can just pull your fingers back, but the emphasis will be pulling the muscle groups in your hand versus under your arm. You follow? So I don't get this question a whole lot, which is probably why I haven't spent a lot of time personally on learning more about what these muscle grips are actually called. But these are things that I've done. These are things that I've seen other drummers do. Okay, now another method that I used to use a lot involved using the sticks as kind of a tool to help you out. So if you take your sticks and you put them out in front of you, like just like this, so the tips going this way, the butt end of the stick going that way, and you're holding it like that. And so let's say the under your arm and on top of your arm it's tense, or for whatever reason you want to stretch it out. You can take that sticks here in this hand and just rotate it over. But it will only feel like it's stretching if your arm is straight. If you bring your arm in, you won't feel anything. Okay, so that's 180 degrees, okay? For me, that's not doing anything for me at all. For some people, that might feel like it's stretching their arm some. Do you feel it's stretching you at all? All right, so check this out. That's 360 degrees. That is stretching to me. So, starting here. Yeah, and you notice how the elbow wants to come in when you try to do that? Yeah, you want to keep your elbow straight. Now, your goal shouldn't be so much to rotate it as much as I'm rotating it. That isn't your goal. Your goal is to stretch out your arm. So at whatever point you start stretching your arm, be it here, like at 180 or maybe 270 or maybe 360 like I was doing. Whatever your goal is, well, your goal is to stretch, okay? It's not about how much you're rotating. Make sense? Because you don't want to hurt yourself. That's not the goal. Now, I actually really prefer this stretching exercise for helping people learn to play traditional grip better. Because when you play traditional grip, you're holding the stick this way, and the only way you can play with a wrist stroke is by rotating your arm. And most people can't lift up much farther than this unless they stretch their arm out and increase their range of motion. And so to me, the best way to do that is to start here and do this thing. So I like that for traditional grip. Does that make sense? And then, if you want to stretch out your other arm, you just do all the same stuff. Try doing it in your right hand. So put the sticks in your right hand, butt into the stick in the palm, stick tips go in this direction, and rotate that. So this really, since you don't play with the sideways grip, traditional grip in your right hand, this doesn't benefit that so much, but it still will stretch out the muscles on the top of your arm and the muscles underneath your arm. Okay? So what we're talking about here is stretching these muscles out and preparing them to, hopefully they won't cramp up. You got to drink lots of fluid, make sure you're eating a pretty decent diet, because drumming is a very physical instrument. But if you're doing all that stuff and you're still getting tight and tense, then it could be more of a anxiety thing. And that's when you want to find for yourself, how can you approach a performance situation and not let your anxiety get in the way of that? So what are some things that you find yourself doing if you're feeling really anxious about a gig that seems to calm you down? If you're aware of anything.
Not a whole lot, actually.
You probably haven't thought about it a whole lot? Okay. So that's something you want to start thinking about. Because everything you're telling me, it could be a physical thing, and we just discussed all that. But I'm inclined to believe that usually it's not so much a physical thing. It's probably more something else. Because you've been playing for a really long time. I know how you play. You never strike me as a tense player. You always strike me as a pretty loose player. So even if you haven't picked up the sticks in a few days, that should sort of come back. But there is something to be said for conditioning. Like, let's say riding a bike. You may never forget how to ride a bike, but if you haven't ridden a bike in a while, you could get gassed after the first mile. Drumming's kind of the same way. Maybe you won't forget how to drum, but because maybe you haven't physically done it in a while, you could get gassed or get tired or maybe can't play as long or as hard as you used to just because the conditioning isn't there. So all that's irrelevant. So all this stuff is relevant. The mental side, the physical side, it's all relevant. But some other things just to think about too, and I don't know if you've noticed this, your drums, when you set them up, they're probably pretty much set up the same way every time, right? The same height and everything. And I don't know what kind of seat you have, but I'm sitting on one of these seats that has one of those threaded posts. So if someone takes my seat with this backrest and they spin it, it'll get either higher or shorter.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't use a seat like this when I gig, usually for that reason. But I find sometimes when I sit down here at my teaching drum set that someone else has been on my drum set and they either lower or raise up the height on the seat. And how high I'm sitting or how low I'm sitting might affect how comfortable I am. And if I don't feel comfortable, guess what my body's going to want to do?
Tense up.
Tense up, because I'm not feeling comfortable.
Actually, that's not an issue for me because I'm always actually really conscious of that, and I make sure that I have exactly this much space between where my leg is sitting versus my snare height. So
yeah, so that's good because that shows an aspect of your drumming setup that you're actively thinking about. So now what you want to include on that is the details behind your mental state and your physical state when you sit down to play.